book of Ruth is a beautiful story of redemption. Redemption in the life of one particular family. Redemption in the life of an entire nation. And it points ahead to the redemption that Christ would ultimately accomplish for you and for me. An Israelite woman by the name of Naomi loses her husband, and soon after she loses both of her sons, leaving her alone with her two daughters-in-law, who were both Moabites because their family had gone to the land of Moab when there was a famine in Israel. Well, when the famine's over, Naomi decides to go back to her home, but she's going back home as a broken woman who has absolutely nothing left. But Ruth, her daughter-in-law, refuses to let her go alone. In an act of incredible loyalty and beautiful love, Ruth says, "I will go wherever you go, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Well, when they arrive in Bethlehem, they don't have any way to get food, and so Ruth goes to find fields where she can glean grain so that they can have something to eat. You see, the Jewish law made a provision. It told landowners that they were to leave behind what was left over after the harvest so that the poor could come through and find grain. And the Lord leads Ruth to the field of Boaz, who just happens to be a close relative of her mother-in-law, Naomi. Well, Boaz hears about everything that Ruth had done for Naomi, and he's impressed with Ruth's character. And so he instructs his workers to make sure that she has extra portions that she can take home so that they would be well provided for. Eventually, Ruth asks Boaz to take her as his wife, fulfilling what was known as the role of a kinsman redeemer, when a relative would take responsibility for another relative who was in danger or some kind of trouble or in great need. So he agrees. They get married, and eventually she gives birth to a son, Obed, who is the grandfather of David. There's redemption all over this story. Through Boaz, the Lord redeemed the lives of both Naomi and Ruth. Naomi had previously told the women in the village, because of all the hard things that she had gone through, to call her Mara, which means bitter, rather than Naomi, which means pleasant. But now the women were saying, "Naomi, you are blessed, because the Lord has not left you without a redeemer." And Naomi held baby Obed in her arms and said, "A son has been born to Naomi." Ruth was a foreigner. She was a widow, a poor widow. But in Boaz, she found a husband who was a man of great wealth, and more importantly, a man who was of great character. The Lord brought redemption to Israel, and specifically to the tribe of Judah. In chapter 1, we're told that the story of Ruth takes place in the time when the judges ruled. And you remember how it was in the book of Judges. It was a time of wickedness and chaos in Israel, when it says over and over that there was no king in Israel, and everybody just did whatever was right in their own eyes. During those days, Israel continually turned away from the Lord. Judges tells us that they married women from the peoples around them, including the Moabites, and that led them astray, and they ended up following after the gods of the peoples. Now, the Lord uses the marriage of Ruth, a Moabite, to Boaz, an Israelite, to do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And they built a godly family through which King David was born, a king who the Lord described as a man who was after his own heart. And the Lord also used this godly family to redeem even the tribe of Judah. You remember from yesterday's reading how Judah and his sons failed to do what was right and take responsibility for Tamar to give her children. And now the Lord uses Boaz, a godly man who does take full responsibility as kinsman redeemer. And so through the descendants of Boaz and Ruth comes not only King David, but ultimately Jesus, the King of all kings. And then Jesus became the perfect kinsman redeemer. He became our brother by taking on human flesh. And then he gave his life for us when we were in great trouble, when we were in deep need. Galatians 3:14 says he redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Colossians 1 verses 13 to 14 says, "For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." And Titus 2:14 says, "He gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, people who are eager to do what is good." Ruth is not just a story of a gracious God who gave a grandson to an old widow and a husband and a son to a young widow. It's the story of a gracious and merciful God who gave a redeemer to an entire world full of people who were lost in their sins and without hope. People like you and like me.